Hello, intro to anatomy and physiology. I feel like it's been a little while since we've had a video lecture for you, so it's nice to virtually be with you again. I got Penny with us today, and I'm wearing one of my favorite shirts. It's got a little dog doing yoga. It says 5 foot feels good. This dog's name is Benji. Don't ask me why I know that. All right, we are talking about the cerebral cortex, so that wrinkly part of your brain today, and the different regions that control different things and different aspects of it. This isn't in your notes, but I just wanted to go over a few little features of the cerebrum with you. So remember, this whole section here is the cerebrum. We have our cerebellum here and the brainstem underneath as far as our major regions of the brain. The other major region you can't view in this because it's all external is the diencephalon. But when we look at the wrinkly part of the brain, you've got all of these ridges, these parts that go up and these parts that go down. These parts that come up are called a singular, a gyrus, or multiple ones are called gyri, and G-Y-R-I. And then everywhere where it dips down, it's called a sulcus. So I always refer to these as like the hills and the valleys in our cerebrum. Now, if you come to a really deep sulcus that goes down really far, we call that a fissure. And so we'll be identifying some major fissures on our cerebrum today. And so it's basically just a deep sulcus, a deep section where it dips far down. So yesterday I asked you, or Monday I asked you to watch a video from Khan Academy, and he went over some of the same material today, but I'm going to go through specifically what you're going to do on your notes here. Colors will be helpful for this. So this guy here is on page 3, and we've got our picture of the brain. You might get some things to color code it. This is the picture from the homework assignment from Monday, as well as the diagram he was using to teach from on the video you watched on Monday. And so I colored mine, and I went off of the same color codes here in case you guys did some labeling yesterday. So I just shaded. It was pretty easy to follow along. I just inverted this image so it matched up with your page 3. There's some pretty definitive lines that you can see, okay, that keep things separate. And so we have our frontal lobe that's all blue, our parietal lobe that's all yellow, the occipital lobe that's pink, and the temporal lobe that's green. These words should sound familiar because each of these lobes sit right underneath these skull bones that they're named after. Remember, this was the frontal bone of our skull. Parietal bone, I was described as being next to your part of your hair, the parietal bone. Temporal, by your ears, your temples, and occipital there in the back. So lobes are named just after the bones that they sit under, which is pretty easy. So I took a picture of this guy that you have here, and I'll go through and uncover each of these things as we label them. So I tried to sort of color coordinate some things on this. So I first shaded everything, but then you'll notice some of these areas where I shaded them in with kind of these lines. I used color pencil, and then I used kind of a marker to go over them, and we'll talk about what those regions are towards the end. But first, let's label the lobes. So we have the frontal lobe that I drew in blue based on that image. Okay, then we have, and that's letter D on your sheet. Letter L on the sheet is pointing to our parietal lobe, which I colored in yellow. Then we have our occipital lobe to the back. That's O-C-C-I-P-I-T-A-L, lobe. So this whole section in the back is the occipital lobe. And then lastly, right here, we've got our temporal lobe. So that's the letter F branching off here. Okay. All right. Now, if you were just looking at a non-colored fleshy piece of brain, it would be kind of hard to tell where some of these lobes begin and end. So what you look for is these really deep fissures, and they have different names. So the main one that separates my frontal lobe from my parietal lobe, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll get to there. That's the central sulcus. But we can't forget our cerebellum. She's already snoring. You can't forget the cerebellum right here that's in charge of our balance and coordination, and then our brainstem. We can't see the midbrain of the brainstem. It would be up here, tucked up underneath, but we have our pons and our medulla oblongata. So these are the two parts of my brainstem. I very lightly shaded those brown colors, not really important here for those though. All right, so going back to those sutures or fissures, we have a major suture that divides my frontal lobe from my parietal lobe, and that is called the central sulcus. Okay, so this dip down, right, the sulcus, and it's central because, and it would kind of line and run right here. So we had our transverse fissure, suture when we did the skull and the skeletal system right here, or our coronal suture right here. The central sulcus sort of sits right underneath that, dividing the frontal from the parietal. Then we've got the one that divides our parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and that is called the parietal occipital sulcus. So it's just basically saying, I'm the sulcus between the parietal lobe and occipital lobe. And then our other very large sulcus right here is the lateral sulcus, sometimes even called the lateral fissure because this one goes down pretty deep, if you had an actual fleshy brain in front of you, you could peel that lateral sulcus, and there's another lobe called the insular lobe that sits underneath here, but you can't really see it. Hey, I'm gonna throw something at her because she's being a bad student. Okay, so continuing on here, I have left for you guys to label these areas that I've kind of shaded in with the pen to show these specific regions on each one of our lobes. So our frontal lobe, and we'll get into more details about what they do, but like your frontal lobe does lots of things, including your thinking and reasoning and decision making. But the back part right next to that sulcus, this whole region right here, is called the primary motor cortex, and it controls all my motor movements. So when I decide I need to throw another something at Penny, that is my primary motor cortex that coordinates this sort of motor movement of my body. It's also sometimes called the precentral gyrus because in this section it goes up right before that central sulcus, and so it's right in front of that central sulcus. So it's before the central sulcus, and so it's the precentral gyrus. Then on the other side, the back side of that sulcus, I have the postcentral gyrus. It is the area of the brain that is your primary sensory cortex. And so the primary sensory cortex is what's going to sense the world around you. So like the feel of paper, okay, on my hands, or the feel of the keyboard in front of me is going to be the sensory information that's sending information to my brain, and I decide how and what to do with that information. She's being too snory. All right, so then we have, coming up next here, this other little section, which is in the frontal lobe. So I kind of used a bluish color. I think I used like a purple here. It's the smaller section on the frontal lobe, and that's called the Broca's area. And it's named Broca because of the gentleman that discovered it. This is the part of your brain that allows you to speak and perform speech. So the words that are coming out of my mouth, those are being formed from that area of my brain, the Broca's area. It's where I can actually articulate that. And if you think this part's responsible for motor parts of my body, my mouth, my lips is motor movements. And so this area is a motor reaction. Opposed to that is this area over here. It sort of overlaps between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And this is called Wernicke's area, Wernicke's. And this is also involved in speech, but it is how you understand speech. So this would be where you can understand the words coming from my mouth. Right? This is the area of the brain that would light up for understanding. Broca's is speaking. This is understanding the language. If you're bilingual, you have maybe a more developed Wernicke's area because you can speak and understand different, at least understand in this area different languages, which is cool. All right, the other areas that I have here is right kind of, this one's easy to remember because it's basically like where the ear would be if, you know, the skull and everything else wasn't removed, is the auditory cortex. So this area on my temporal lobe is what allows like the sound to hit my ear, and then that information gets interpreted into maybe Penny snoring, or maybe the words coming out of my mouth, or music, or birds chirping, or whatever you can hear. And then the last other cortex region is on the occipital lobe, here in the very, very back. And I always think this is super interesting. My eyes are in the front of my head, but the part of my brain that decides what I see is actually back here. So this sunlight coming in the window and, you know, Penny sitting on my lap and colors on my worksheet here is all being interpreted by the visual cortex here in the very, very back of my brain. So these different areas of the brain are responsible for interpreting different information for our body. Now, some of these regions get broken up even more, but the two I want to focus on right now is our primary sensory cortex and our primary motor cortex. And this next picture is really weird. It's kind of freaky to kind of look at and interpret. So right here, I have my brain, okay? And let's see, this would be the front, my anterior side, and this would be the posterior side of my brain. Yeah. So right here, this line right here is my two separate hemispheres of my brain. So the cerebrum is broken up into two sides. There's this thing called the longitudinal fissure that divides it in two. And then right in between the orange and the blue right here is called the central sulcus. So in front of the central sulcus, I have my primary motor cortex. So that's the part in orange. And then the part in blue is my sensory, my primary sensory cortex on the post-central gyrus. So what they've done here in this diagram is showing you the different parts of the body that are controlled by our different parts. So I believe, right? So this picture here, what makes it so kind of goofy is it is showing you the different sensory things that our body can feel and the amount of brain space that's taken up by it. And then over here is the motor things that our body can control and how many things it can sense. And the larger the body part is, the more brain power we focus on it. So if you look at this diagram, the face is huge. The lips and the mouth, really, really large. We've got some excellent sensory motors, sensory neurons in our lips. This is why kissing is so much fun. We also have great control over our mouths because we vocalize right here. All of this lips, jaw, tongue, vocalization. Here's the tongue right here. It looks kind of goofy being detached. But this is where all of the control of my mouth is. That helps with speech. Also notice on both sides the hands, okay, and how much space that they take up. We have excellent motor control of our hands. And also, if you can remember when we did our sensory lab and we put dots on our different parts of the body, our hands were way more sensitive in pinpointing areas than, say, like your leg and other body parts. We have way better sensory information on our hands and face. So when you look at your feet and like your trunk and your torso and your hip, it doesn't make up very much space. Those are kind of just more generalized movements and motions and feelings that we have in those body parts. So I always like showing this picture because it is weird and freaky and looks like something out of a nightmare, but it shows you how much part of your brain each of these things are controlled by. I think it's super fascinating. All right, that's it for today. We are going to get into a little bit more of what the brain is made up of and how it controls itself more later. But you have 2 days, since this post is coming out so late on Tuesday. You have Tuesday and Wednesday to work on this, and we'll do new material on Thursday. Hope you guys are having a great week. From me and our snoring buddy Penny here, I hope you guys have a good one. All right, bye-bye.